Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Welcome back to TFR for another edition of Investor Stories. On this segment, the experts talk about a startup that failed and the causes of that failure. Here's the segment called Mortems.
On today's special segment, we have Brian O'Malley of Forerunner. Brian, can you tell us the story about a portfolio company that failed and why it failed?
A lot of times we will work with founders again where, one company didn't work out, but, they gave the right try and it just didn't materialize. There's a company that I invested in called Luma. And Luma, this had a unique solution for mesh Wi-Fi networks. Basically, this idea that in your home, you shouldn't have one router and have dead zones or have to switch to different areas. And it was founded by this guy, Paul Judge, who's a really special individual, both from a technical perspective as well as just, typical kind of founder charisma and understanding of the market that they were going after. The challenge there in some ways was that the market opportunity was too obvious and too big out of the gate. And so instead of there being a couple year period for them to be able to sort of operate where no one else cared, Qualcomm recognized the opportunity. They put this mesh feature set into their chips. And all of a sudden you had Comcast and larger providers offering not as good of a product, but like good enough that it became more difficult for us to sell. And so that was a lesson in my mind where a lot of times you're looking for the company that has this really big market opportunity in front of them. And that's maybe not the right framework. Sometimes it's better to have a more narrowly defined initial market, but one where the right product or solution is going to expand the market opportunity because it avoids noise along the way. The other one that I was going to mention is a business called Shuttle. This was, kind of Uber for your kids solution, which might sound silly in hindsight. But again, there's a lot of parents that are really struggling with how to get their kids from point A to point B. And the idea of putting them in some UberX, doesn't really feel like the right solution. They had a unique offering where they were working largely with elementary school age kids. But the founder himself didn't have children. And it might sound like a silly thing, but if you talk to someone who doesn't have kids, the difference between a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 9-year-old, they might all look the same, but they're wildly different when you're actually parenting them. And so I remember being at the Discovery Museum. This is when I had younger kids up in Marin, which largely caters towards like real young, 3 to 5-year-olds is sort of where they're operating. And there was this big shuttle set up and they were actively passing out postcards. And this is a business where they didn't even work with kids that were under 6. And so just because of the founder not intrinsically understanding the use case, even though he had a really great background in ride sharing and understand all the regulation and all the rules there, it was a great reminder in this kind of North Star principle of like the best founders need to be uniquely qualified to solve the particular problem they're going after, even if the opportunity is an interesting one.
On today's special segment, we have Brad Burnham of Union Square Ventures. Brad, can you tell us a story about a portfolio company that failed and why it failed?
Sure. And there's another lesson in this. Actually, I'll give you one that we invested early on in a company called Bug Labs. And Bug Labs had a vision for how a phone should work, how a smartphone should work. And their vision was it should be componentized, essentially, and that you should be able to replace the camera and replace the speaker and replace the various components. And they actually built a device that allowed you to plug and play various components in a smartphone. And this is quite early. And it's the inspiration, the entrepreneur Peter Semmelhack's inspiration was, believing in open source and believing that ultimately these devices should have a number of interfaces that allow for competitive markets. So if you think about the way the PC emerged, IBM, in their rush to get something to market, assembled a system out of a bunch of off-the-shelf components, and as a result had to figure out interfaces between the various components. And we ended up with very competitive markets for disk drives and and memory and everything that you plugged into a PC. And Peter's vision was that this is the way we should be thinking about phones. And we agreed with that vision. I think I still agree with that vision. I still think that the devices that were offered, and the kind of planned obsolescence that the vendors that offer these devices build into these phones in order to encourage us to upgrade every 2 years isn't healthy for the environment, isn't healthy, for competition. But so why did it fail? It's easy to say too early, but, I think more realistically, there's a relationship between openness and complexity. And, and basically when you're building a consumer product, there's only a certain amount of complexity that consumers are willing to take on in order to get the flexibility that openness gives you. And we overestimated that.
Is there an implication or insight with regards to Web3 on the last point you just made?
Well, yeah, in the sense that there's no question that the consumer experience of Web3 is still very primitive and very complex and intimidating in lots of ways. And so that experience has to change. But, I was at least around in the early 90s. Ecologic spun out in, I guess, sort of 89 or something. And then I ended up in AT&T Ventures in 93. And, we were watching the emergence of the consumer internet then. And at the time, AOL was a much more comfortable place to be, and CompuServe was a much more comfortable place to be. And their interfaces were much simpler and more intuitive. And the internet was intimidating and scary and confusing. And the openness of it created confusion, and it was difficult. But there's no question that it was a better architecture for building a sustainable business over time.
On today's special segment, we have Aaron Holliday of 645 Ventures. Aaron, can you tell us a story about a portco that failed and why it failed?
So a portfolio company that failed. We invested in a company called Voodoo Manufacturing. And these were exceptional founders. These are second-time founders who was building a company in the same category, which was in the 3D printing space. And so they had an exit before, and they came back at it to build a new company in a similar category and leverage some of the learnings that they had from their prior company. The company ultimately went out of business, not because the founders weren't exceptional, but the market wasn't there to pull it. And so as I described earlier, we take bets on speculative markets, right? And so we were speculating on whether or not the 3D printing market would become much larger than it was at the time. And that market hasn't grown as quickly as we had anticipated. And therefore, the product that the Voodoo Manufacturing team was building wasn't being pulled as fast as some of the other kind of products in our portfolio.
That will conclude this installment of Investor Stories. If you're enjoying the program and would like to see it continue, take a moment and leave a 5-star review in iTunes. Also, if you'd like updates on new content from TFR, as well as the top 10 VC articles every week, go to fullratchet.net and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, that will wrap things up for today. Until next time, over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining me.